am not looking forward to this. I'm not looking forward to listening to an hour and 30 minutes of the Sarah McBride is on the Ezra Klein's show. But I'm gonna do it anyway, and I guess y'all are gonna watch me do it, for better or worse. But before we get into that, you know what? Let's go ahead and throw up just a little bit of fan art. That way we have something that is less stressful before we get into things. Woo! And I'm coughing because there was something stuck in my throat. I apologize. This one is from Dice Mistress. Me going, no more AI art, because it's not art if AI generated it. Holy fuck. It's not. Jesus. Anyway, thank you very much for your fan art submission. If you would like your fan art to be shown in a future video, the best way to do so is to drop it into the fan art section of the Discord. That all said, if you would like me to cover anything specific, drop it into the video suggestions area. But with that all out of the way, let's go ahead and take a listen to this.
Trump, in his inauguration speech, was perfectly clear about what he intended to do.
As of today, it will henceforth be the official policy of the United States government that there are only two genders, male and female.
Starting the day of that speech, Trump launched an all-out effort to roll back trans rights, using every power the federal government had, and some that it may not have.
President Trump has signed an executive order which declares the U.S. government will no longer recognize the concept of gender identity.
President Trump directing the Secretary of Education to create a plan to cut funding for schools that teach what he calls gender ideology.
This afternoon, President Trump makes a move to ban transgender athletes from competing in women's sports.
Ban on gender-affirming care for transgender kids.
A ban on gender-affirming care for transgender inmates in federal prisons.
In order to, like, make the point that this shit's happening.
These executive orders, many of them have not actually gone into effect yet. But when I look across the country, we're already hearing the stories of impact.
It's a complete dehumanization of transgender people. It's about privacy and dignity for me to be able to change my passport to male.
It's going to come along with having to out myself to like Border Patrol agents.
We are begging to be allowed to continue our service, and you're just going to wash us away.
A lot of the things Trump is doing in this term have put him on the wrong side of public opinion. But not this. In a recent poll where Trump's approval rating was around 40%, 52% of Americans approved of how he's handling trans issues. And if you look more deeply into polling on trans rights, the public has swung right on virtually every policy you can poll. Banning trans medical care for minors, that's a majority issue now. A few years ago, it wasn't. Trump didn't just win the election. He and the movement and ideology behind him have been winning the argument. Sarah McBride is a freshman congresswoman from Delaware, where she was formerly a state senator. She is the first openly trans member of Congress, and her view is that the trans rights movement, and the left more broadly, has to grapple with why their strategy failed, how they lost not only power, but hearts and minds.
We have to grapple with the reality of where people are beyond this room or this city or my state. Meeting people where they are is not selling out. It's what this work is.
I was struck talking to McBride how much she was offering a theory that goes far beyond trans rights. What she's offering is a counter to the dominant political style that emerged as algorithmic social media collided with politics. A style that is more about policing and pushing those who agree with you than it is about persuading those who don't.
All right, let's see what happens here.
Sarah McBride.
So before we get into this, the amount of information I have about this interview, based on the stuff that I've read when I originally read this interview before, is not good. It's not. But I do want to do my due diligence. Let's go ahead and take a listen to the full opinions here.
Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So I want to begin with some polling. So Pew asked the same set of questions in 2022 and 2025. And what it found was this collapse in, I would call it persuasion. So they polled the popularity of...
Lenari says, is Klein a grifter? So, Lenari, just out of curiosity, we're this early into the video. Why is that what you're... I'm just curious. How did you get to that thought? All we've gotten in the beginning is effectively a slideshow of all of the bad things that Trump has been doing in regards to trans people, with the general idea that this is bad. And your immediate thought is Klein a grifter or what? If he's a grifter, what are you concerned that his grift is? And why is that the initial thought? Said, I have no idea who he is. I know who McBride is. I'm just wondering what the tone of the interview is. Right. You'll understand the tone of the interview by watching the interview. I do not think it is good form to start out by quite literally poisoning the well.
Protecting trans people from discrimination in jobs, housing, public spaces. That had lost 8 points in those 3 years. Requiring health insurance companies to cover gender transition lost 5 points. Requiring trans people to use bathrooms that match their biological sex gained 8 points. When you hear those results, what to you happened there?
By every objective metric, support for trans rights is worse now than it was 6 or 7 years ago. And that's not isolated to just trans issues. I think if you look across issues of gender right now, you have seen a regression, right? Marriage equality support is actually lower now than it was a couple of years ago in a recent poll. We also see a regression around support for whether women should have the same opportunities as men compared to 5, 10, 15 years ago. And so there's a larger regression from a gender perspective that I think is impacting this regression on trans rights. But I think it has been more acute, more significant in the trans rights space. I think, just candidly, I think we lost the art of persuasion. We lost the art of change making over the last couple of years.
So the question is, did we lose the art of persuasion, or did the right wing win it? Because there's a difference between those two things. One of them is the general, you remember when the Democrats were doing their study on how to talk to working men? And everybody clowned on them for that. Because, how do you talk to working people? I don't know. Go to a fucking job site. When that's happening, then yes, I can agree entirely that we, the left broadly, which includes the Democratic Party, did in fact lose on communication. Elsewise, we wouldn't be spending millions of dollars to try to figure out how to talk to people when that's the easiest fucking thing to do. You just sit down and talk to them. So that's that's one side of it. However, if the right won on it, then the conversation is instead the right had a giant marketing machine that alienated and eliminated thoughts for trans rights in the United States. The conversation is less about the failures of a party, and the conversation is more about the triumphs of another party and how best we can emulate those. Ali High says, the left plus centrist, perhaps? No, we're not doing the pedantry game. When we talk about the left in the United States, that includes Democrats. Yes, in terms of the larger political Overton window, yes, they are more center than anything. But when we are talking about brass tacks, sides in the U.S., the side that is more likely to care about things the left cares about are the Dems. I say more likely because you'll often get establishment Dems who do not actually care about what the left wants broadly. They'll care more about enriching themselves, or they'll care more about neoliberalism, which is more of a or a centrist position. Rumjack says, I wasn't the only one who felt a little off with I can't comment on that. That is about another creator personally. But I have seen some things through the grapevine.
We're not in this position because of trans people. There was a very clear, well-coordinated, well-funded effort to demonize trans people, to stake out positions on fertile ground for anti-trans politics, and to have those be the battlegrounds rather than some of the areas where there's more public support. We're not in this position because of the movement or the community, but clearly what we've been doing over the last several years has not been working to stave it off or continue the progress that we were making 8, 9, 10 years ago. And I think a lot of it can be traced to a false sense of security that I think the LGBTQ movement and the progressive movement writ large began to feel in sort of the post-marriage world. I think there was a sense of cultural momentum that was sort of this unending cresting wave. I think there is this sense of sort of a cultural victory that lulled us into a false sense of security, and I think in many ways shut down needed conversations.
The Night Rider says, I thought neolib was center-right. Again, this is why I'm not getting into the pedantry. The Overton window, I will say it for the last fucking time, the Overton window is nothing more than an explanation. It is an explanation of what is observed. That's it. I don't give a fuck how far to the left or center something is. I don't. Not in the context of this. It's not a useful conversation to me. It is a Star Wars versus Star Trek conversation to me. If somebody is in the conversation in favor of trans rights, then we are broadly on the same side. That's what I give a fuck about. If they are wanting to end the housing crisis and make sure that homeless people have a place to sleep, and that workers don't have to work every single hour of the goddamn day to be able to afford living, then we are broadly on the same side. And I can't give a flying fuck after that. I cannot be made to give a flying fuck after that point. That said, so far in this interview, it seems like Sarah's focus is saying that there was a giant concerted effort of the right wing in order to demonize trans people. And at the same time, that the left broadly was not equipped to deal with that. So a failure on our side and a triumph on the other side.
And I think, you know, the support that we saw for trans rights in 2016, 2017, it was sort of a mirage of support in some ways, because I think there was, in the post-marriage world, there was a transfer of support from the LGB to the T. I think for two reasons. One, I think people said, well, the T is part of the acronym, so I support gay people, so I'll support trans people. It's all the same movement. But two, I think in those early days after marriage, a lot of people regretted having been wrong on marriage in the 90s and in the 2000s. And they went, you know, I didn't understand what it meant to be gay, and therefore I didn't support marriage. And I regret not supporting something because I didn't understand it. So I'm going to, without understanding, support trans rights because I don't want to make that same mistake again. And I think that resulted in a lot of us, a lot of our movement stopping the conversation and ceasing doing the hard work of opening hearts and changing minds and telling stories that over 20 years had shifted and deepened understanding on gay identities that allowed for marriage equality to be built on solid ground.
Okay, so in that I actually do agree. Maybe not on the mechanics of how we got there, but I have kind of seen this, I don't understand this, and therefore I'm gonna support it until I see that somebody's getting hurt. I have kind of seen that a little bit. But if I were to think about, say, people not knowing how to advocate for trans rights, I would say I'm not an expert on it. I advocate for it because I have people I care about who are trans. And even if I didn't, there are people who are trans that do not deserve hatred being aimed their way, so I'll still advocate for it. I have been corrected many a times on how I advocate for trans rights. I have. Because I am not the best person to advocate. I do not have the best rhetoric. I do not have the best articulation. I do not have the best knowledge. I do not have the best research skills. I don't have that. What I have is a drive, which isn't enough sometimes. But there's plenty of people who are like me who don't know all the ins and outs, but still want to advocate. And then this vicious cycle does happen, and I think Sarah has a point here. There's a cycle that happens where you get a bad advocate to argue in favor of trans rights, and then that bad advocate gets memed on. And after that bad advocate gets memed on, people then start coming to the defense of the advocate, even if they're not coming in defense of the rhetoric. And then we get this spiral where suddenly, well, look at the left supports. The left supports something stupid. And look at all of these people jumping in to support the thing when they don't realize that what we're doing is supporting somebody who may or may not have the best idea of how to engage in advocacy or allyship, but is still doing their best to. Then we get the other side of that, which is equally problematic, where people say, oh, well, you're not trans, sit down and shut up, it's not your fight, it's not your expertise. You're not black, sit down and shut up, it's not your fight, it's not your expertise. You're not gay, sit down, shut up, it's not your fight, it's not your expertise. Every single one of you that does that shit online, unsubscribe from me right now. Holy fuck, you all are insufferable. The idea that a minority group should be the only one speaking for them is to ignore the raw numbers and to say that, no, it's okay. If only 2% of the population votes, you'll get what you want. No, that's not how anything works in reality. You need allies. You need allyship. It's better to educate people around you than beat them the fuck down. And on the other hand, it is good to support people who engage in clumsy allyship, but maybe have some conversations where they can be improving their rhetoric. Cool. Cool. We're all in there. So I kind of agree a little bit, but I know what comes later in the video or in the interview because of the stuff that I've read. So let's keep going.
And I think that allowed for the misinformation, the disinformation, that well-coordinated, well-funded campaign.
We're going to increase the speed a little bit. But yeah, the point about the disinformation against the trans movement was able to be increased because there was not a good controlling of information on the left side. Okay, cool.
Take advantage of that lack of understanding. And the support on trans rights was sort of a house built on sand.
I want to connect two things you said there, because I hadn't thought about this exactly before. So you made this point that there's been a generalized gender aggression, which is true. And you also made this point that people had this metaphor in their minds that I was wrong about gay marriage. I didn't understand that experience. So maybe I'm wrong here too. But that one thing maybe that's different here is there's a set of narrow policies here, like non-discrimination, and then a broader cultural effort, right? Everybody should put their pronouns in their bio or say them before they begin speaking at a meeting. That was more about destabilizing the gender binary. And
I'm going to be honest, the introduce yourself with your gender at the beginning of every conversation, that shit's kind of exhausting, actually. Like, I'm willing to do it. I have no problem with doing it, but it is exhausting and it feels ritualistic. It feels like solving a problem that's not really there, because the minute you misgender a trans person, they can look at you and correct you. We also don't tend to use gendered language all that often when you think about it. Especially if you know someone's name. You don't tend to go, ma'am, sir. You tend to go, David, Danielle. And then we get those weird people that say, oh, you used the word they, and you used the person's name instead of saying their gender. Oh, you must be a closet bigot. Shut the fuck up. Shut the fuck up. You're not being useful. You're not being useful. You're alienating people. You're not being a useful person. Shut the fuck up. Go away. You just want to feel entitled. That's what you want to do. So I have seen some of that. Okay.
People had a much stronger view. Like, I do know what it means. I've been a man all my life. I've been a woman all my life. How dare you tell me how I have to talk about myself or refer to myself? And that made the metaphor break. Because if a gay marriage fight was...
Access says no one actually does it anyway. I have been in meetings where people have introduced themselves with pronouns and everything. It's weird, but I understand why it happens. I'm not against it happening. I can say that because it is not something that I am that used to, it does feel a little clunky.
It was about what other people do. There was a dimension of this. It was about what you do and how you should see yourself or your kids or your society.
I think that that's an accurate reflection of sort of the overplaying of the hand in some ways, that we, as a sort of coalition, went to Trans 201, Trans 301, when people were still at a very much Trans 101 stage 1. And then 2, I think there were requests that people perceived as sort of cultural aggression, which then allowed the right to say, we're punishing trans people because of their actions rather than we're going after innocent bystanders. And I think some of the sort of cultural mores and norms that started to develop around inclusion of trans people were probably premature for a lot of people. We became absolutist, not just on trans rights. I think across the sort of progressive movement, we became absolutist. And we forgot that in a democracy, we have to, one, grapple with where the public authentically is and actually engage with it. And
all right, so this is where I started to have issues with the interview. So, on the one hand, I do agree that there's a lot of people who assume that everybody has this base knowledge of how trans people work, and because they all have this base knowledge of how trans people work, then they can engage in more broad conversations about gender and it be just seemed as normal. When you see those TikToks of somebody going, what's a demi-boy versus what's a para-boy? And the answer is, I haven't had breakfast yet, nor have I had caffeine. Shut up. Like, yes, I can understand having people who are having these conversations that are effectively conversations to be had in a post-gender world. And you're sitting here going, okay, but I still have a gender. What the fuck are you talking about? Also, I still haven't had breakfast. Why is something burning? Like, I can understand that. On the other hand, though, this conversation of, well, we still have to grapple with where the public is at right now, it kind of, but not in the way you're saying. Like, yes, you have to grapple with where the public is at the moment, but at the same time, why should you be telling trans people that, oh, you just have to grapple with where the public is at in regards to your gender? How does that sound fair to trans people? Like, you do, as a politician who I would assume has some level of understanding of how rhetoric works, how do you make that request to trans people and say, hey, before you go be yourself, in general, go make sure that everybody around you is on the same page with what the fuck that means. For most people, that's not going to seem like a fair ask. For most people, they're going to tilt their head at you and go, no, absolutely not. I am myself. I wake up as myself every day. And I don't give a fuck what that other person thinks about myself. And this gets compounded a bit when you consider that people who are more likely to have interesting versions of gender expression tend to be on the autistic spectrum, because the way that they interact with social norms is already vastly different than how most other people interact with social norms. It is the nature of having a way your brain is organized that just does not adhere to social norms and in fact pushes back on social norms more often than not. So when you get those people who are told, hey, maybe don't, quote, be your authentic self in public, then you're going to get pushed back there as well. You will. It's just going to happen. So replace trans people with literally any other marginalized group, which you say with black people. Yeah, see, that's the thing that's confusing here as well. Is I don't see what the end game is when you're saying, well, maybe the public just isn't ready for trans people. Maybe the public just isn't there on trans issues. Maybe the slaveholders just aren't there yet on thinking that black people are human. Like, no. If I were to be as charitable as humanly possible, she did point out our failures to educate the public. So it could be argued that since she is saying that we had these failures to educate the public, it makes sense the public would be acting this way. But again, it's really weird to tell people that they should be paying attention to where society is when it comes to advocating for their human rights. Like, you can see how that's a weird conversation, right? Like, that's just a weird conversation to be having. Again, if it were black people, the conversation would be, well, maybe the plantation owners just aren't there yet. I remember the public backlash to Boogie when Boogie had his video where he said that maybe people weren't ready for marriage rights, and I think the better thing would have been to roll them out slowly. As if human rights and equal rights should be a thing that should be advocated for slowly. If the public is dragged, kicking and screaming, into having it to acknowledge that trans people are people who deserve human rights like everybody else, then so fucking be it. So fucking be it.
And I think, you know, we and part of this is false.
Maybe, hold on, maybe before we continue, maybe I actually do something actionable here. So, if the argument is going to be the public was not ready, broadly, for trans rights, also Prime Case, thank you for the follow, or not follow, but thank you for the raid, I appreciate it. But if the conversation is going to be maybe the public at large wasn't ready for trans rights, then maybe the conversation needs to be, how do we get them there? Maybe instead of spending $20-50 million on a campaign to figure out how to speak to men on a work site, when you could just speak to men on a work site, maybe spend that time trying to figure out how to convince people that trans people are people. Maybe spend that research money there, because that research money is going to be spent one way or another, so maybe spend it on something that you're obviously having communication issues with. Justice says, why are human rights something that needs to be political? For the same reason that housing rights need to be political. If it is something where a disagreement can be had, then politics will follow. Drellick says, let's treat people as people. Right, but remember, the right wing has been fed the notion that treating trans people like humans means calling them freaks. Because in their minds, we would do that in any other context. Exodar, thank you for the follow. They'd say, oh, of course I recognize trans people are human, and I'll treat them as humans. And when humans do stupid stuff around me, I point it out. Like, that's what they're going to do. That's what they're going to say. That's the thing that you're having to advocate against. That's the thing you're having to fight against. Prime says, hope you're doing well. We were just talking about Iran as well. Keep up the fight for our trans brothers and sisters. Thank you very much for the well wishes, Prime. I appreciate it. Hopefully your stream went well. We covered the Iran stuff earlier, and now we are talking about the Sarah McBride interview that has the internet up in arms right now. That society has to be dragged kicking and screaming towards progress. Yeah, generally society does have to be dragged kicking and screaming towards progress. I think it's a good idea for us to recognize that and to instead be willing to figure out how to do that. Like, my well was already poisoned on Sarah McBride when after the ban on... Like, after the bathroom ban went through, she said, oh yeah, I'll use the men's bathroom at work. Like, no, bitch! Nobody should be doing that. Trans women should not be using the men's bathroom. and arguing from a position of power and arguing from a position of influence that that's what you're going to be doing sends the signal to everybody else that their rights are merely a suggestion that can and should be taken away by people on a whim. Drellick says, I was trying to get at the fact that there's a study on how to talk to men instead of talking with them and treating them as human instead of a study, just like men and women. That's fair. That's fair. But the difference is, to figure out how to talk to men on a workplace, instead of doing a massive study, all you should have to do is just go to that workplace and talk with them. Something you should be doing as a politician anyway, because your constituency deserves that. In contrast, when it comes to communicating trans rights to people, instead, you can't just sit down and have a conversation with somebody about it and get good results. Reason I say that is, here's how that conversation is going to go, because I've had this conversation. You start the conversation going, well, do you believe in trans rights? And now the left, broadly, understands that this means a right to medication, a right to be gendered correctly, a right to be in restrooms, a right to be involved in sports. There's a lot of stuff that comes with that simple statement. But the immediate go-to response from anybody on the right, when you say, do you believe in trans rights? They will say, well, trans rights to what? Don't they have the same rights as everyone else? You get a bunch of people who don't understand the concept of sleeping under a bridge being illegal does not affect rich people and poor people in the same way, but it's a law that applies to both rich people and poor people, so they'll say that the law is equal. You get people in that mentality, and you try to talk with them when they don't even know what HRT is. This was a conversation I had at a restaurant with a friend like 3 days ago, where I said HRT, and he just kind of like shook his head for a second and said, HRT, what's that? What's HRT? This is a friend who's been around sake, does not know what HRT is. So when you say the words trans rights, you've got like 12 fucking barriers to get through when it comes to getting somebody on your side on that issue, because you guys don't even know if you're talking about the same thing. Ali Holly says, no, they understand. They know what we mean. They're fascist toying with language. I'm not talking about the politicians. The politicians aren't the ones you have to convince. You've got to convince the people who vote them in. You've got to convince the regular Joe Schmoes who don't have a ton of power. Those are the people that you're having to convince. And those people, generally speaking, do not know. I have had these conversations on the ground with them. These are not people who all the time are malicious. Oftentimes, they are ignorant. Lee Hall says these are the same people who argued that gay and lesbian couples had the same right to get married to someone of the opposite sex that everyone else had. Yeah, there are people who are going to be disingenuous there, but there are going to be other people who have been sold rhetoric and do not know any better, and you've got to figure out how to talk to those people. And you can't just demonize them, because guess what happens? Nothing gets accomplished. Drellick says, I feel like the right general populace has this idea that anyone who needs proper medical care and are getting more than they are because they don't get regular medical care. And at that point, the conversation needs to be about us all having the same rights to medical care. But you've got to figure out where the person is in that conversation first. And I'm not going to lie, there are parts of this interview so far that I have great disagreements with. I think, yes, you do need to be dragging society kicking and screaming into the world where human rights are advocated for. I believe that. But there is definitely something in the conversations I have had with people in my local area where they either broadly support trans rights but don't really know what that means, and so they end up being kind of a poor advocate. Or you get people who have no idea that trans people even have different rights than any of us, and they think that they actually have more rights than us. And are sold that lie. So we have to be able to talk to those people. We have to be able to figure out how to have that conversation. And simply demonizing them doesn't do that. Kenmark, yes, we need to have a reliable knowledge base to help with educating others. This is why stuff like Vice Rhino's database on trans issues, or like the, not database, but the list of all those studies, is such a good resource. Because a general knowledge base is something most people have. But even then, I'm kind of getting ahead of myself. Because when we're talking about that database, or that list of studies, we kind of have a problem. How many of you in the chat right now know how to read a study? How many of you are familiar with how to sculpt a bibliography? How many of you know how to look through the citations of a study to see if it's even worth reading? How many of you know which journals are likely to publish bunk versus journals that are likely to publish decent, sound, scientific literature? These are all skills that many of us that have them take for granted. And they are skills that I had to learn autodidactically. I learned how to make a bibliography when I was in school, but when it came to figuring out citations and shit, that stuff I had to figure out on the go while doing content on the internet. We do not have a good source-based method for teaching people. We don't. We haven't for a very long time. And even if you specifically go, oh, well, I know how to read this literature, that's super cool. I promise you, your friend at the bar doesn't. So even though we have things like a big list of studies that are incredibly helpful, or that giant list that H. Bomber Guy has, that he showed in a video once and then threw like 1,000 sources in the description of a video, even though we've got all of this stuff, throwing that information to people doesn't do anything because they don't know how to fucking read them. And we can't just sit there and have a seminar on how to read a study for every single person we have a disagreement with. We have to find other ways to get to them, other ways that are far more efficient. And to that, interpersonal stories are the best thing you can use. And guess what? That's what the right did. You know how the right sold the left, or sold their audience on being against trans rights? Riley Gaines. They sold their audience on being against trans rights by having a super effective boo-hoo story about opportunities being stripped away from cis women by trans people. They sold their audience on that narrative. They didn't have to cite a study. The United States didn't get its own version of the Cass report until earlier this year, and the Cass report didn't happen until late last year. They didn't have a massively funded study to show to people, to show them that they are incorrect or correct. They never needed it. They had stories. They preyed on people's interpersonal emotions. That's what they did, and it worked. So that's what we need to do, because it works. We need to get better about constructing those stories and taking a hold of those narratives and controlling those narratives. Because it fucking works. It worked for them, and it will work for us.
By social media, we sort of decided that we now have to say and fight for and push for every single perfect policy and cultural norm right now, regardless of whether the public is ready. And I think it misunderstands the role that politicians and, frankly, social movements have in maintaining proximity to public opinion, of walking people to a place. We should be ahead of public opinion, but we have to be within arm's reach. If we get too far out ahead, we lose our grip on public opinion and we can no longer bring it with us.
So this is another part that I disagreed with. When I read this interview before. The idea that, well, the politicians need to be within arm's reach of public opinion. No, they don't. Bernie Sanders is currently one of the most well-known politicians, and he brings out super crowds. And his opinions are very far to the left of establishment Democrats, and very far to the left of what people in American society generally deemed okay and acceptable. You don't need to be within arm's reach of what people consider acceptable. You need to be able to sell them on a story. You need to be able to reach into their hearts and minds. If every Democratic politician right now were to take a firm stance on trans rights, all of them, right now, public opinion would shift in favor of trans rights. If you are the people who are at the head of a cultural movement, and you mention that, you recognize that, then you have the ability to grip its momentum by the balls.
And I think a lot of the conversations around sports and also some of the sort of cultural changes that we saw in expected workplace behavior, et cetera, was the byproduct of maybe just getting too far out ahead and not actually engaging in the art of social change making.
The position for more maximalist bans is one that you need to be in a hurry. Trans people are dying now, suffering now, and that there isn't time for decades of political organizing here. And also that maybe it works, right? Or maybe there's a reason to believe it works. So you've been in more of those spaces than me. How would you describe how the sort of more maximalist approach and culture evolved and why?
Well, first off, I think you're right. It is understandable. I mean, this is a scary moment. I'm scared. As a trans person, I am scared. And I recognize that when the house is on fire, when there are attacks that are dangerous, very dangerous, that it can feel like we need to scream and we need to sound the alarm and we need everyone to be doing exactly that. I get that instinct. I understand it. I understand that people would say, if you give a little bit here, they'll take a mile. We're not negotiating with the other side, though. In this moment, we have to negotiate with public opinion. And we shouldn't treat the public like they're Republican politicians. And when you recognize that distinction, I think it allows for a pragmatic approach that has the best, in my mind, the best possible chance of shifting public opinion as quickly as possible. It would be one thing if screaming about how dangerous this is right now had the effect of stopping these attacks. But it won't.
You call it a sort of abandonment of persuasion.
Yes.
So I don't know if I agree with that, because I think, generally speaking, most people don't understand that there is a reason for an alarm to be sounded. If you're not sounding the alarm, what are you doing instead? Like, what's the plan there? If you're not sounding the alarm that Republicans are trying to strip trans rights away, then what are you doing? What is your plan of attack then? Just ignore it? I don't think that works either. I think you have to actually set, like, when that alarm is ready to be sounded, I think it's important to talk about it. I think it's important to let people understand that it's an issue that matters. When there's a reason to sound the alarm, letting the public know that you're paying attention to the things that are that should be alarming, I think that's a good thing, right? Also, Dead Domain, thank you so much for the raid. Holy shit. We're getting raids from all the cool people. We're covering the Sarah McBride shit. I don't know if you've covered that already. I saw that you were talking about your time at the LA protests. Said Trump has a low approval rating, so I think that it's fine for the Dems to be aggressive. I think Sarah McBride is too cautious. Right. The thing is, like, what's that caution gaining you? If you've already lost the momentum, then what's the problem with just, like, what's wrong with just leaning into trans rights? What's wrong with leaning hard into the things that you know you should be advocating for?
Became true across a variety of issues for progressives, also for people on the right. And sometimes I wonder how much that reflected the movement of politics to these very unusually designed platforms of speech, where what you do really is not talk to people you disagree with. It's talk about people you disagree with, to people you agree with, and then see whether or not they agree with what you said. And there's a way in which I think that breeds very different habits in the people who do it.
I think that that's absolutely right. I mean, again, we're not in this place because of our community or our movement, but clearly we aren't in this place because we weren't shaming people enough, because we weren't canceling people enough, because we weren't yelling at people enough, because we weren't denouncing anti-trans positions enough. I think the dynamic with social media is that the most outrageous, the most extreme, the most condemnatory content is what gets amplified the most. It's what gets liked and retweeted the most. And people mistake getting likes and retweets as a sign of effectiveness. And those are two fundamentally different things. And
so this part I actually agree with. This part I actually do agree with. People do tend to find that whatever they're doing that is the most inflammatory, that gets the most clicks, that gets the most attention, that must mean that they are being effective, when that's not really what that means. Kind of. It depends on the medium. So if you're on Twitter, getting 1 million views just means you got 1 million views. But if you're, say, making a Hollywood movie and you are getting that much attention, that's a bit different. But then you run into the problems of a movie is very easy to misinterpret. That's why you get unapologetic fascists who really, really, really love the movie adaptation of Starship Troopers.
I think that whether it's subconscious or even conscious rewarding of unproductive conversations has completely undermined the capacity for us as individuals or politically for us to have conversations that persuade, that open people's hearts and minds, that meet them where they are. And
I can agree with that one. So it's something I've talked about before, where there's a time for dunking and there's a time for a bit more compassionate rhetoric, let's say. The time for dunking is when there's an audience. When it's time to show strength in a way that is completely unambiguously your, like showing that it's your arena. That's the time for strength. That's the time for dunking. Then there's a time for compassion. The time for compassion is when it's your friend at the bar. The time for compassion is when it's your coworker. The time for compassion is when it's the guy across from you in a Magic the Gathering game. That's when you need to be a little softer. That's when you need to guide a horse to water. That's when you don't need a single decisive victory. You need several small wins and a war of attrition over a person's mind. That's when you need that. Zippity-doo-yah says, not this guy, no, I apologize that we are dealing with this guy.
And I think the other dynamic that we have with social media is that there's sort of two kinds of people on social media. The vast majority of people are doom scrollers. They just go on and they scroll their social media. 20% maybe are doom posters. 10% on the far right, 10% on the far left. The people who are so strident and angry that they're compelled to post, and that content gets elevated. But what that has resulted in for the 80% who are just doom scrollers is this false perception of reality. Take a person, let's say they're center left, and it gives them a false perception of everyone on the left believes this, and It pulls them that way. And then it gives them a false perception that everyone on the right believes the most extreme version of the right. And it creates this false binary extreme perception, availability bias, because all of the content we're seeing is reflective of just the 20%. And it's warped our perception of reality. It's warped our perception of who people are and where the public is. One of the best things about being an elected official is that I have to break out of that social media echo chamber, that social media extreme world, and interact with everyday people. And you see, yeah, there are real disagreements, but that 80% of the doom scrollers or the people who aren't even on social media are actually in a place where we can have a conversation with them.
When I ask this question,
I do agree with. This is something that I've noticed when talking to people in my local areas, is they are more likely to ask questions and follow up on things than they are to try to have a loud back and forth with you. Whereas when you're on the internet, it feels like everybody comes out in a show of force. So I can agree with that. That makes sense. That aligns with my experiences.
I don't just mean on trans issues, but you represent Delaware, which is a blue state, not Massachusetts blue, but blue. If you took your sense of what Democrats want or what the country wants from your experiences on social media versus your sense from traveling around your state.
Yeah, thank you for the follow.
How would they differ?
I think they would differ in two ways. One, they would differ in the issues that we would focus on, right? What you hear on social media is a preoccupation with sort of the most inflamed culture war issues that you almost never hear when you're out talking to voters in any part of the state. What you hear is a understandable catastrophizing around democracy, which you don't hear nearly as much when you're out talking to voters. What you hear when you're talking to voters is you hear about the cost of living. You hear about the bread and butter issues that are keeping people up at night, people who aren't on social media or aren't posting on social media. And so you hear a difference in priorities, but then you also hear a difference in approach. People are hungry for an approach that doesn't treat our fellow citizens as enemies, but rather treats our fellow citizens as neighbors, even if we disagree with them. An approach that's just an approach that's filled with grace. And I think on social media, we have come to this conclusion, rightfully so, that people's grace has been abused in our society. That the grace of marginalized people, the patience of marginalized people has been abused. And that is true. But on social media, the course correction to that has been to eliminate all grace from our politics.
So this part I actually agree with entirely. I actually do agree with this entirely. The way that we engage with people in general is very, very inflammatory. It doesn't do a whole lot of good. Paige says it's the layers of separation associated with being online versus in person. I've mentioned a thing or two only to have multiple streamers tell me, fuck you. I'm one of those streamers. I think it might have been on one of our conversations about perfectionism and something needing to be like 12 different versions of right and correct before it's good enough. And I'm just not that person. But yeah, when I mention that there's a genocide happening towards trans people, when I mention that in a group of my friends, they just kind of look at me funny. And I have to explain to them what I mean and why it matters. And I have to have a conversation about what the term genocide means, what the term fascist means, what the term autocrat means. We have to have a decent back and forth in order to get to that point. Whereas if I'm online, I can just say, yeah, trans people are genocided, and there's going to be somebody else who's as terminally online as I am, and they're going to go, that makes sense. That's it. Like, honestly, people in general are very much in the camp of nothing ever happening. People out and about in their everyday lives are very much in the camp of nothing ever happens. And then you get people who are more politically inclined, who will understand what you're talking about, but they are fewer and far between. Most people wake up, go to work, do their best, and then go to sleep and take a shit, maybe in the bed. That's about it.
It's how dare you have conversations with people who disagree with you? How dare you be willing to work with people who disagree with you? How dare you compromise?
I've had that argument with people, but the how dare you compromise is one where I'm gonna have to have a bit of disagreement. So I do agree that people have had that, how dare you ask me to have a conversation with a right-winger who wants me dead. Dawarumba, thank you so much for the rate. Jesus Christ, tons of y'all. But I've had that argument with people where I say, you should talk to people who politically disagree with you. You should have those conversations. And I'll get a bunch of pushback on that. But when you're a politician, I do think that there's merit to not compromising on trans rights. If you are going to use that as a springboard to say, maybe there's some rights for trans people we can give up, then I disagree.
How dare you seek to find common ground with Republicans? And I think when you go out into the real world, Democrats, independents, and Republicans, there is a hunger for some level of grace, for us to just not be so angry at one another and miserable. They want to see and know that we actually do have more in common, and therefore it gives you hope that persuasion is not only necessary, but can actually still be effective.
What does grace in politics mean to you, and when have you either seen it or experienced it?
I think grace in politics means, one, creating room for disagreement, assuming good intentions, assuming that the people who are on the other side of an issue from you aren't automatically hateful, horrible people. I think it means creating some space for disagreement within your own coalition. I think it's a kindness that just feels so missing from our body politic and our national dialogue. And look, I saw it in the Delaware State Senate on both sides of the aisle, whether it's in Republicans in Delaware joining on to be co-sponsors on an LGBTQ panic defense bill that I was the prime sponsor of, whether it was the discourse being much kinder and more civil on a whole host of even cultural war issues. I saw that grace have the effect of lowering the temperature, removing some of the incentives to go after vulnerable people in this country, in our state. I saw it with my colleagues on the Republican side of the aisle who didn't vote for bills that were deeply personal to me, and yet we still found ways to work together. We still found ways to develop friendships. And look, I know that that places more of a burden on me than it does on them, right? I know that when you're asking a marginalized person to extend grace in a conversation, you're asking much more of that marginalized person. But change making isn't always easy, and it's not always fair. And why would we expect that the extra burdens and barriers of marginalization would cease at the point of overcoming the marginalization, of creating the change necessary to eliminate prejudice and create equal opportunity in our society? You know, that's where the barriers are going to be greatest. That's where the burdens are going to be greatest.
It reminds me of a line that I hear it less now, but I used to see it a lot, which is, it's not my job to educate you.
Mm-hmm.
And I always thought about that line because on one level, I understood it. I mean,
I do hate that line. I really do. So, fun fact, I had that line thrown at me, not about trans rights or anything like that. I believe I've had it thrown to me on trans rights. But do you want to know one of the most egregious examples of that being thrown at me? Had nothing to do with political issues. It had to do with a fucking World of Warcraft guild. Now, I don't know if any of you were online when this happened, but I used to be part of a guild called the Argent Crusade on Season of Discovery. And the guild leader mentioned that Season of Discovery was going to be going into Burning Crusade. And I said, oh, that's so cool. When did Blizzard announce that? And what I got was effectively a version of, it's not my job to educate you. It's not my job to tell you. It's not my job to Google that for you. It's on you to figure that out. And after an hour or two of research, what I came to was one post from a Blizzard employee saying that Season of Discovery was not going to be ending. But I found nothing on them going to TBC. So what ended up happening is this person had inferred that SOD not having a end date per se, where they shut down the servers, would mean that of course they would be going to Burning Crusade next. Now, we have since gotten confirmation that that is not fucking happening. We have since gotten confirmation that SOD is, in fact, not just ending, but ended. The final patch for Season of Discovery has happened. The Scarlet Enclave has already been a thing that players have conquered. That is the end of Season of Discovery as we understand it. They said that, you know, something might happen in the future where the staff behind SOD is done and they're doing something else, and you should look forward to that. But for the time being, the Season of Discovery experiment for World of Warcraft is done. That's it. Do you know how infuriated I was when somebody told me, go research this shit, I'm not your Google machine, and then they were fucking wrong? Not only were they wrong, but they were so obstinate and arrogant and fucking shitty about it. I say that as somebody who's also very arrogant and shitty about things. But they were so obstinate and shitty about this that my response was to leave that guild. I was like, nope, I do not want this bitch in charge of my raids. I do not want this bitch in charge of my loot. I do not want this bitch in charge of my fun. Because this is not somebody who should be in charge of people on any level whatsoever. That was my experience. And now that we've got confirmation from Blizzard, like hard confirmation, that they were wrong the entire time and were literally just operating on assumptions, forever that's going to be my example of how stupid the "it's not my job to educate you" isms are. Especially when you yourself are not actually educated, you're just taking an informed guess, and that informed guess ends up being wrong. Zippity Doo says, isn't it just another way of not having to back up your shit? Yeah. The "it's not my job to educate you" people do not need to be part of serious conversations. If you are going to have a conversation about something that requires scientific study to come to the conclusion of, then I really hope you're willing to have that stuff on speed dial in case you need it. Lenari says, I usually associate "it's not my job to teach you" with, say, a black person being told what a microaggression is. Like, white person, I'm tired, and you can just look that up yourself. It's not always just with bullshit. If you're gonna say "it's not my job to educate," then I don't actually care what your intention is. I'm telling you what the effect downstream is. The effect downstream is that it makes somebody look ineffective, arrogant, and while it can be used to stop bad faith questions, there are other ways to handle those bad faith questions as well. One of them can be ignoring it. You don't have the time, so don't try to respond. I'd also suggest having some copy-paste responses. What's a microaggression? And you just copy-paste the Google definition. And that's all you do.
It's probably not your job to educate anyone. And then if you're in politics, if what you're trying to do is political change, I always found that line to be almost anti-political.
Yeah.
Right? That if what you want to do is change a law, change a society, change a heart, and you're the one who wants to do it, well, then whose job is it? And who are you expecting to do it?
It's an understandable frustration, but it's the only way forward. And look, I don't believe that every person from an underrepresented or an unrepresented community needs to always bear the brunt and burden of public education, right? Like, I don't believe that every LGBTQ person has to be out and sharing their story and doing all of that hard work. But for the folks who are willing to do it, we need to let them. And one of the problems we've had is that we've gone from "it's not my job" as an individual person who's just trying to make it through the day to educate everyone to no one from that community should educate. And frankly, no, we should just stop having this conversation, because the fact that we are having this conversation at all is hurtful and oppressive. And maybe it is hurtful, but you can't foster social change if you don't have a conversation. You can't change people if you exclude them. And I will just say, you can't have absolutism on the left or the right without authoritarianism. Right? The fact that we have real disagreements, the fact that we have difficult conversations, the fact that we have painful conversations is not a bug of democracy. It's a feature of democracy. And yes, that is hard and difficult. But again, how can we expect that the process of overcoming marginalization is going to be fair? And I think the discourse has taken this understandable critique of society and the way we operate and the burdens we place on marginalized people. And we've somehow said, well, the one place that we have control over whether we allow for that marginalization is in the strategies we use to overcome it. We're not going to engage in that because it's sort of self-oppression. And I think that is such a self-defeating and counterproductive approach.
I've been thinking in the past couple of months.
I can agree with that, actually. Yes, it should not be anybody's job to educate other people. Yes, it should not be anybody's point to. But you kind of fall for the just world fallacy when you don't. In a just world, you should never have to educate people on trans rights. In a just world, you should never have to argue against transgenocide. In a just world, you shouldn't have to do these things, but we don't live in a just world. We live in the world we've got, so we need to make that world better. I can understand that perspective.
It's because we are in the most illiberal era of my lifetime in American politics. I don't mean liberalism in the sense of supporting or not supporting universal healthcare, but in terms of due process, in terms of tolerance, in terms of the basic practice of politics and living amidst each other. And it's also made me think about the need to clearly define what the practice of liberalism itself is. What do you think it is?
I think it is
the practice of liberalism is the world of failure. It is the advocation for social change and the inability to engage in the economic change required to make that social change happen. It is wanting a better world and thinking that the tools of the oppressor are the best way to make that world happen. This has been an argument against capitalism once again. And that's all it's been. That's it. I'm sorry. You have a different definition of liberalism. Let's hear it.
The recognition that in a free society, we are going to live and think differently. I think it is the allowance of that disagreement in the public square and the tussle of that disagreement in the public square. And that is uncomfortable. That is not easy. And yes, there are going to be people in that conversation for whom it's going to be more difficult and more uncomfortable. But in the internet world, you can't suppress diversity of thought. It will always bubble up, but it will bubble up if suppressed with an extra bitterness and an extremism fostered in that echo chamber that it's been suppressed to. It'll inevitably bubble up like a volcano. And I think that's what we're seeing right now. I will say, I think, while the left made this mistake,
I don't know if I agree with that. This is very much the everybody should say whatever they want regardless of what the thoughts and consequences are because it makes the world better somehow. Sunlight's the best disinfectant. That argument. I used to actually agree with that argument. I don't think I do anymore. Because I believe that racists should be scared. I don't believe that we should live in a world that tolerates racism. Now, granted, when I say racism, I'm meaning racism in its strongest forms. I'm not meaning we shouldn't live in a world that tolerates you making a black joke. You can make a black joke. It's fine. Your black friend makes black jokes. Neat. What I'm saying is that things like the 13th Amendment and the way that it just moved the role of slavery into the prison system, that should not be fucking tolerated. Living in a world where we have a higher amount of black people who are marginalized by the police should not be tolerated. There are forms that it takes that should not be tolerated in any way, shape, or form. But I do believe that because where I draw my line might be a little different than where someone else draws their line, maybe that's where the diversity of thought comes in. Maybe. Could be wrong. Depraved Ambient says, but that's left-wing absolutism. Is it? I have a line where I've drawn it, but everybody draws the line somewhere. Even people who believe in freedom of speech have an area where they draw the line. Everybody, regardless of stance, has an area where they will not go any further. Sarah said that, but Sarah said absolutism is bad. I think it depends on what we define absolutism as. There are certain things like advocacy for human rights where I think absolutism is entirely okay. And there are certain things when it comes to, like, hey, what groups of people are we allowed to make jokes about, that I think maybe absolutism is a bit stupid. Because then you have to get into the further conversation of, well, why are those jokes happening? Why are those jokes being made and by whom? You actually get to have a conversation there. That she said absolutism from left and the right is authoritarianism. Right, but she didn't define absolutism. Like, she didn't define what it is. Is absolutism having a line in the sand that you're not willing to cross? Like, so she's arguing that you can't have democracy with absolutism from either side, but what the fuck does absolutism mean here? Like, unless you're willing to define it, unless you're willing to say what it is, then it's kind of a meaningless conversation. Said it's a bad argument if she's not willing to define it anyway. Agreed. It is a bad argument if she's not willing to define it. And dead. Depraved Ambient says she's pushing for she's hinting that pushing for trans rights is left-wing absolutism. I'm willing to agree with you, but I don't know if that's the case. Let's see.
Stake of fostering an illiberalism based on a sort of false sense of cultural victory. I think now the right is making the exact same mistake. I think they're overplaying their hand. I think they're interpreting the 2024 election to be a cultural mandate that is much greater than what it actually is. And I think that if they continue to do that, there will be a backlash to the illiberalism, the cultural illiberalism, not just the legal illiberalism, the cultural illiberalism of the right, in the same way that there's been a backlash to the cultural illiberalism of the left.
I think, agree with that more. We're going to get to that. I want to talk for a minute about the 2024 election and the aftermath. So there's been...
Interesting. So she didn't define what absolutism is. She's willing to say that it's bad, but she's not willing to argue what it is. If you're not willing to... And granted, also, Ezra did not ask her to define it. So this is a failure on Ezra's part to get a clear definition on absolutism, and this is a failure on Sarah's part to define it. So that is kind of a problem. Depraved Ambient says getting gay rights and pushing for trans rights is cultural illiberalism. That's what she just said. I'm not 100% willing to agree with that, because she didn't connect those dots herself. She has said similar things earlier in the interview, and that's enough for me to connect those dots on my own. But she hasn't really said that. She's just vaguely defined, like, so we have a different problem here. We have a different problem. And I think you're kind of illuminating what my problem is. Not my problem with you, but my problem with her. when you are willing to say things like the cultural liberalism on the left, the cultural liberalism on the right, but you're not willing to define what that is, you're not willing to say what that is, then people can insert whatever they want into there because it is a vague morass that you can put whatever the fuck you want in. I don't know if what she meant was against trans rights. I don't have a way to know that. And I think it's a bit silly to try to argue that that's exactly what she meant without having the ability to bore into the brain. But on the other hand, the fact that she did not explicitly define these terms and was not willing to, granted, was not pushed on it either, so that's a problem on Ezra's part, is its own problem. It's like when you do the stochastic terrorism thing. You didn't ask a single person in your audience to do something, but you heavily implied that it'd be the right thing to do. He said, but dog whistles exist, implications exist. Yes, implications exist, dog whistles exist, but I don't know if we can look at everything as that, especially in this situation. The thing is, I agree with you that what she's saying is bad, but we are disagreeing on the how. I am disagreeing because she's making it so vague. By making it so vague, we are able to have this disagreement in the first place. And yeah, this is an issue in general because this is an advocate of the abundance doctrine, which we'll get into in another video. I've got a whole thing on the liberal version of Project 2025 that also threw trans rights under the bus that we'll have to get into in another video. But my problem is I don't know what in her argument, I do not know what cultural liberalism means, because I do not know what the line in the sand that the vague left has drawn that she is arguing is bad. I don't know what absolutism is in this interview because it was not defined. I can imply what these things mean, and then I can be angry about the thing that was implied, but at that point, I'm creating a ghost to be mad at, and I don't need to do that. I've got plenty of real things to be mad at already. I can be mad that I was given the opportunity to create a ghost in the first place, because I don't think I should have had that opportunity. I think if we're going to use strong language like that and then argue, like, build arguments on top of that language, we should define those terms.
Been a lot of rethinking and self-recrimination among Democrats. One of the comments that got a lot of attention came right after the election when Seth Moulton, who's your colleague, a Democratic congressman from Massachusetts, said, quote, Democrats spend way too much time trying not to offend anyone rather than being brutally honest about the challenges many Americans face. I have 2 little girls. I don't want them getting run over on a playing field by a male or formerly male athlete. But as a Democrat, I'm supposed to be afraid to say that. What did you think?
See, that shit pisses me off. Because if you're willing to, I don't know, advocate for hormone therapy. Not hormone therapy for kids, but, puberty blockers, right? If you're willing to advocate for puberty blockers, you don't have to worry about that. Also, this idea of, I don't want my daughter being ran over by a male athlete. Do you not think fat women exist? Do you not think fat women exist? Like, are you not worried that there's going to be some woman who is big and chunky who's gonna, like, run down your little girl? Yeah, this one is the ceding your rights framing. No. This is the shit that pisses me off. You're a fucking coward if you are not willing to advocate for people's rights to engage in sports as trans women. It's just a cowardly position at this point. We have the studies to show exactly what kind of an advantage is given in most sports. And we can see from those studies that the advantages that are given are in such small margins after a year of HRT that they are not something worth considering. They are not something worth being upset about. I'm worried the male is going to hurt them. Okay, cool. So we put a small, tiny twink lad, and then we put a big-boned She-Hulk of a woman, and then we wonder which one's going to actually run over your fucking kid. The gender was never part of the conversation, you dullard.
You think when you heard that?
One, that it wasn't the language that I would use. But I think it came from a larger belief that the Democratic Party needed to start to have an open conversation about our illiberalism, that we needed to recognize that we were talking to ourselves. We were fighting fights that felt viscerally comforting to our own base, or fighting fights in a way that felt viscerally comforting to our own base, rather than maintaining proximity to the public and being normal people. I think the sports conversation is a good one, because I think, you know, there's a big difference between banning trans young people from extracurricular programs consistent with their gender identity and recognizing that there's room for nuance in this conversation. And I think the notion that we created this all on or all off mentality, that you had to be perfect on trans rights across the board, use exactly the right language, and unless you do that, you're a bigot, you're an enemy. And when you create a binary all on or all off.
So I'm actually going to say, on the one hand, we kind of got a little close to defining what cultural liberalism was, because she said it in response to the person saying that they were afraid to speak on trans issues. That got us a little closer to defining cultural liberalism. It's not perfect, but it's something, I guess. Okay, cool. Now, let's talk about some of the problems with this here. Saying, well, we need to be able to have a conversation here. You're right, we do. What does that conversation look like? What does that conversation look like? Because I can have a conversation where I say trans rights are important, and that be a conversation. I've had a conversation. You can argue that trans people should not be able to have rights, and we are technically still having a conversation. I would argue that it doesn't have any worth or merit anymore, but we are still having a conversation, right? Are Democrats obsessed with this idea of conversation and compromise instead of results? Instead of being effective? That'd be my thought. But let's continue.
Off option for people, you're going to have a lot of imperfect allies who are going to inevitably choose the all-off option. And what ends up happening is the left will excommunicate someone who not only Seth voted against the ban on trans athletes, but we would excommunicate someone who uses imperfect language. Yes, look, again.
So the other part that I want to say is actually this part I agree with. So I saw this shit happen in my thread. Somebody used the word they to describe Sarah McBride, a gender-neutral term, a term that can describe anybody of any gender at any point. A filler term, if you will. And they got lambasted in the comments of that thread. They got eviscerated for using the word they. Do you know what that does to somebody? That doesn't actually make them want to improve as a person. It just makes them feel isolated. It just makes them feel angry. It doesn't actually make somebody a better ally. It just makes you a purity testing piece of shit. I watched that happen in that thread. And I've seen it happen to me. Depraved Ambient says, I point out that some trans people dislike having the pronoun they applied to them, but I try to do it gently. See, I've had people get mad at me for using the pronoun they. And at that point, the person can come up to me and correct me. I do not need their fucking army. Paige says, I want to see that thread. Go on to Blue Sky, and it's going to be one of the posts where I talked about the Sarah McBride situation that has like 18,000 or 1,800 likes or some shit.
And not language I would use. But we would excommunicate someone who's saying that there's nuance in this conversation and uses language that we don't approve of, yet still votes the right way, is exactly what's wrong with our approach. And look, Seth's not going anywhere, but for a lot of everyday folks, if they think how Seth thinks, or if they think that there's room for nuance in this conversation and we tell them, you're a bigot, you're not welcomed here, you're not part of our coalition, we will not consider you an ally, the right's done a very good job of saying, listen, you have violated the illiberalism of the left, you have been cast aside for your common sense, welcome into our club. And then human nature starts to...
You know what? I actually agree with that. The right is very, very good at taking people who feel like they've been alienated from the left and bringing them into the fold. With Ortho says, I think that people can sometimes feel under constant attack on social media. I think it would be good if people remind themselves that not everybody is their opposition or being competitive online. Yep. I don't know. Like, I do think that that's something... Like, it's one of the reasons why I'm never going to be on board with people who hate Vosh for being edgy. One of the benefits to having, like, your online liberal, lefty, edgy boy is that people are going to look at that person and go, oh, I can still be part of the left coalition too. Even though I use imprecise language. Even though I say mean things sometimes. Axo says, Vosh isn't even that edgy. Comparatively speaking, to a lot of people, he is. And it's one of the reasons he uses that approach, and it's one of the things that I've talked to them about, and I agree with generally. If we are going to see the right wing try to recruit people who feel disenfranchised for not being good, pure, perfect lefties, then it makes sense to have a dropping ground for them that isn't necessarily Matt Walsh and Ben Shapiro. Renegade says, I don't like Vosh because he instigates violence against motorcycles. So the stupid shit he has said in his feud with Squid Tips, that stuff I can't forgive. That stuff is stupid. Like, there's being edgy, and then there's literally arguing that other people have less of a right to live. And that shit's dumb. Actually, it's probably a joke. Yeah, but it's one of those jokes that maybe people ought not make. Like, I would never joke about hitting a motorcyclist. Because, like, who's the butt of that joke at that point?
To be, once you then get welcomed into that club, human nature is, well, I was with the Democratic Party on 90% of things, maybe against them on 10% of things, or sort of in the middle on 10%. Once you get welcomed into that other club, human psychology is you start to adopt those positions. And instead of being with us on 90% of things and against us on 10% of things, that person now welcomed into the far right club starts to be against us on 90% of things and with us on only 10% of things. And I think that dynamic is part of the regression that we have seen. And not only the regression we've seen, but the hardening of the opposition that we've seen on trans issues. We have been an exclusionary tent that is shedding imperfect allies, which is great. We're going to have a really, really miserable, self-righteous, morally pure club in the gulag we've all been sent off to.
I think this goes to your point in a way.
Again, you know what? As much as there's are areas of this interview that I really, really disagree with, that part I agree with. I 100% agree that we need to have more imperfect allies than a bunch of really, really miserable perfect people.
So after he made those comments, the Times reported that a local party official and an ally had compared him to a Nazi cooperator. There were protests outside his office. I was always struck by which part of his comments got all that attention. It was a part I just read to you, but he'd also said this. Having reasonable restrictions for safety and competitive fairness in sports seems like, well, it's very empirically a majority opinion. He's right on that. But should we take civil rights away from trans people so they can just get fired for being who they are? No. He was expressing opposition to what was about to be Donald Trump's agenda.
Yeah.
And this space of his divergence from an issue that had already been lost, right? That was the polling was terrible on it. That was where people on the left focused. And his expression of support and allyship, as I saw, barely ever got reported or commented on.
Mm-hmm.
It struck me as telling.
I think it absolutely is telling. And I think it's the best thing for trans people in this moment is for all of us to wake up to the fact that we have to grapple with the world as it is, that we have to grapple with where public opinion is right now, and that we need all of the allies that we can get. Because if you, again, Seth voted in against the bans. If we are going to defend some of the basic fundamental rights of trans people.
Han, so the person who's doing the interviewing is Ezra Klein, who's the dude, and the person being interviewed is Sarah McBride, who's a woman. Not sure what we're getting at there with that one, but Axo, what? Axo. That was literally just an example of Vosh being edgy. You said I don't see him as that edgy. Paige gave an example of Vosh being edgy. Sorry for the confusion. I was talking about the dude in the, okay. I see. I see what's happening here. I see what's happening here. This is a person whose first statement ever on my stream said, "I'm here to troll leftists and chew bubblegum." And then a month later came back after not doing shit, saying this is the highest viewed stream that I'm not currently banned from. But from the 1 minute I have been here, I'm guessing that will change. And then have posted a whole bunch of other stuff after that. Said, please, thank you. Okay, later. We're here to take out trash. What a pathetic life you have to live. Like, how pathetic do you have to be where the only thing that gives you entertainment is frustrating a bunch of people and getting banned? Jesus Christ. Be better as a person. Seek help.
We are going to need those individuals in our coalition. If you have to be perfect on every trans rights issue for us to say you can be an ally and part of our coalition, then we're going to have a cap of about 30% on our coalition. If we are going to have 50% plus one, or frankly, more necessarily 60% or more in support of non-discrimination protections for trans people, in support of our ability to get the healthcare that we need, by definition, it will have to include a portion of the 70% who oppose trans people's participation in sports. And right now, the message from so many is you're not welcome. And your support for 90% of these policies is irrelevant. The fact that you diverge on one thing makes you evil. And it also misunderstands the history of civil rights in this country. I mean, you can't compromise on civil rights is a great tweet. But tell me, which Civil Rights Act delivered all progress and all civil rights for people of color in this country? The Civil Rights Act of 1957, the Civil Rights Act of 1960, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Civil Rights Act of 1968, or any of the civil rights acts that have been passed since the 1960s. That movement was disciplined, it was strategic, it picked its battles, it picked its fights, and it compromised to move the ball forward. And right now, that compromise would be deemed...
You know, that's a really, really cute story. That's a very, very cute story. But are we ignoring all of the people that went out in protests? Are we ignoring the protests that actually got violent during that? Are we saying that, no, the difference between the trans right movements and the civil rights movements is that the civil rights movement was really well coordinated, really well organized, and had way better execution? Like, no. No, you had all these same conversations in those movements. That's why we look back on certain thought leaders from those movements more favorably than others. That is a super whitewashed version of how civil rights came to be. Yeah, it wasn't a perfect world. We didn't get a perfect version of civil rights. But I promise you, not one person during that whole ordeal was sitting there celebrating compromise. They were celebrating attrition. Trans people need to not be arguing in the world of compromise. They need to be arguing in the world of attrition. There's a difference. Jesus. They got their rights because they were willing to compromise more. Why should that be what we are advocating for? What the fuck?
Unprincipled, weak, and throwing everyone under the bus. And that is so counterproductive. It is so harmful. And it completely betrays the lessons of every single social movement and civil rights movement in our country's history. And we have an example of a very successful social movement in recent history with marriage equality. Where would we have been in 2007 and 2008?
Nakibri says, what do you mean by the use of attrition here? So what I mean is, when you are engaged in a war of attrition, you expect that there are going to be losses. It is a framing device. The framing device of compromise is one to argue that the goal of politics is to find some form of respectability. The civil rights movement had more respectability in it. Therefore, they got their compromise. And they had to make a bunch of compromises to get here. That frames it as a group of people who engaged in that respectability politics, who allowed themselves to be tone policed. When that's not really the reality of what happened. Framing it instead as a war of attrition, where it's not, we have to give a little to get a little. It's, we are going to fight for every scrap we're able to get. And if we're not able to get all the scraps, we will at least get all the scraps we can. The end result is the same. You get a few rights a bit at a time, over time. But the framing of it is less respectability politics, less demure, maybe the rights will come to me if I just advocate the right way, and more, no, I'm just going to keep fighting for rights. I'm going to keep fighting for my rights. Recognize it says she's literally complaining about what she's doing right now. She's throwing rights activists under the bus for being too extreme by wanting basic fucking access to a public space in healthcare or being anti-segregationist. Remember, there is a level of absolutism to not allowing absolutism at this point. We can't do this with those extremists. Well, those extremists are the ones with the fire in their belly. Yes, they should learn how to deal with other people and deal with imperfect allies better. I agree with that. But to frame the rights that were gained via a war of attrition over several decades as this respectability circle jerk is stupid.
If not only we had not tolerated the fact that Barack Obama was ostensibly not for marriage equality then, but if we had said to voters, if you're not even if you vote against the marriage ban, but aren't quite comfortable with marriage yet, that you're a bigot and you don't belong in our coalition, where would that movement have been? The most effective messengers were the people who had evolved themselves. We had grace personified in that movement, and it worked beyond even the advocates' wildest expectations in terms of the speed of both legal progress and cultural progress.
Did it? Because last I remember, that literally just happened because we had the right Supreme Court justices in. What? That didn't happen with a speed and a grace. That happened because a couple of justices were in our favor. We had some liberal justices who were doing their thing. What? What the fuck are you talking about? Half the problem is that that entire spiel was in the hands of those justices, but we never got a fucking political win ever on marriage equality. We got it in the courts.
Because we created incentives for people to grow, we created space for people to grow, and we allowed people into our tent, into that conversation who weren't already with us.
You mentioned the period in 2008 when Barack Obama was running for president. And at the very least, his public position, many of us suspected it was not his private position, but his public position, was that he opposed gay marriage. That was the mainstream position at that point in the Democratic Party. And there was a compromise position they all supported, which was civil unions. Is there an analogy to the civil unions debate or position for you now?
I think on the sports conversation, it's local control. It's allowing for individual athletic associations to make those individual determinations. And in some cases, they'll have policies that strike a right balance. In some cases, they'll have policies that are too restrictive.
So it's states' rights? Do you think that morality is best dictated by location? Is that where we're at? No, Sarah. No, the correct position is HRT. The correct position is the one the Olympics have already gotten to, which is if you are on HRT for a year, then you are allowed into the league that you are trying to get into. If you have been on puberty blockers and are still on puberty blockers and you are in high school, then you are allowed into the league you are trying to get into. That's our position. That should be the position. No, the area of the country you're in should not determine what rights you have. That's always been a fucking stupid position. Because that's always been a position that assumes that something is good for a Floridian, but not good for a Pennsylvanian. That's never made any goddamn sense to me.
And I think that is the equivalent to the civil unions position in that debate. By allowing for Democratic voters, independent voters, hell, even some elected officials to take that civil unions position, one that met voters where they were, it gave some of our politicians who needed it an off-ramp so that they didn't have to choose between being all on or all off. And it allowed that conversation to continue and prevented more.
So it allowed a conversation to happen and it stifled rights. Because, again, the rights to marriage got enshrined by the Supreme Court. But okay. Recognizes and says her understanding of history is terrible. Her understanding of the issues is terrible. She's literally just running into a neolib New York Times podcast to shout, "I'm one of the good ones" from the top of her lungs. That's the longer into the interview I get, the more of that I'm getting.
Harm from being inflicted.
I want to pick up on the polling. So there's this YouGov polling from January that looked at all these different issues. And there are a lot of issues around trans rights that actually poll great. So protection from trans people against hate crimes, plus 36 net approval. Banning employers from firing trans people because of their identity, plus 33. Allowing transgender people to serve in the military, which Donald Trump is trying to rescind, plus 22. Requiring all new public buildings to include gender-neutral bathrooms. This surprised me, plus 7.
Also, I just double-checked it just to make sure that I was correct. 2015, Obergefell versus Hodges. The Supreme Court decision that legalized same-sex marriage nationwide had nothing to do with the executive branch, had nothing to do with Congress. But don't worry, having the compromise position the entire time is what we should have been doing, even though that's not what happened here. You know what happened? The left wielded power effectively, technically. The liberals did, I guess, in this case. You know how we lost Roe versus Wade? It wasn't because we weren't allowing enough room for the fucking conversation. We lost Roe because a despot... Actually, no. We lost Roe because a despot president decided that he was going to pack the courts with everybody he could during his tenure, regardless of whether or not he was going to lose his presidential seat, and Congress was willing to help him. The same Congress that stonewalled the previous president when he tried to bring in more liberal justices. The Democratic Party's problem is not that they haven't allowed enough grace. The problem is that they are looking for grace in a world where they should be looking for power. The Democratic Party's issue largely is that they do not know how to wield power. They care so much about public opinion that instead of shaping public opinion, they pay for studies to figure out what public opinion is in the first place. No, the issue with the Democratic Party is not that they didn't have enough grace, it's that they are weak. And that's where we're going to have to end this for now, because this is an hour-and-a-half long interview, and I want to get to the rest of it, and I want to give it the time it deserves. But that is going to have to be in another video. We are 36 minutes into this one, and it has been an hour and 45 minutes on my part. That is a lot of time, and we have more to do. Ali Holly says, Suris, remember, because of this topic, polling only favored interracial marriage in the United States in 1997. Yeah, following polling is fucking stupid. Shaping public opinion is what you should be doing. Do not be limp-shitted and think that you need to follow public opinion where it can go so you can meet people halfway. No. Shape public opinion. Learn how to shape public opinion. My God. Hey, thanks for making it to the end of the video. I really could not do any of this without all of you. Those of you watching, and especially those of you who support me on Patreon. I wanted to go ahead and take a minute to thank all of you who do that, because with YouTube being what it is these days, I really cannot do this full time without the support from each and every one of you. Those people would be Red Joker, Purple Poundini, Jemshin, Britzkrieg, Jupe the Malignant, Michael, Ravalern, Mabbity Babbity, Astral Frontier, Tales of Atonement, Nixie Chan, Kiri Artemis, Limor Pinku, Love Bunny Games, Victorian Alchemist, I'm not saying the last part of that, and you know that. Aurora, Leela Ururaka, Arcton Arclacier, Kiratorian, Dren Hadamata, Jordan M, John L, Lord Bleck, Smiling Game Master, and Fireshard. Thank you so very much. But since you're here, why not go ahead and try watching another one? There should be one that's on the screen right now. And if you are a patron of mine, I wanted to go ahead and thank you again for all of your support. There is still a video you could press, though, if you'd like. I would appreciate it just a little bit.